Okay, so let's slowly start into the final session of today's part of the workshop. Thanks for everybody who's still around here. I guess we have had like a pretty good mix of discussions on the whole subject from the area of, let's say, how European political economy works and what kind of expectations we might reasonably have for the future, and also particular issue areas. This session is about banking regulation, European banking regulation, and without doubt, which way EMU will go, this will play a major role. So I'm happy that we have like 4 promising papers and presentations on this from Jonathan Zeitlin, University of Amsterdam, Diane Fromage, Sciences Po Paris, from Elsa Massoc from Frankfurt, and Sandra Eckert from Frankfurt and Aarhus. I suggest we will try to keep every presentation at around 10 minutes, and with the option, of course, to delve deeper into some subjects upon requests and looking where the discussion goes. So if there's no further questions, I suggest we will just start with Jonathan. So the screen is yours.
Okay, so my paper is on the single supervisory mechanism. This is widely considered to be one of the most significant steps towards further European integration since the Euro, Treaty of Maastricht. And my underlying question is, how can its organization functioning best be understood, and what does this mean for EU governance? And in the paper, what I do is to analyze the SSM from 3 distinct perspectives. First, as a centralized hierarchy seeking to impose and enforce uniform rules, methods, and procedures across the banking union. Secondly, as a polyarchic network seeking to orchestrate intensive cooperation between the ECB and national competent authorities. And thirdly, as an experimentalist organization seeking to accommodate and learn from diversity, first by adapting common rules and procedures to the specificities of individual banks, and secondly, by revising these rules and procedures regularly through peer review of implementation experience at multiple levels. Now, each of these views, as I try to show, highlights important characteristics of the SSM which need to be taken into account. But each successive view also illuminates critical features obscured by its predecessor, and this, I think, leads to a richer understanding of the SSM as a novel institution for EU banking supervision. And what I want to argue is that the most encompassing perspective is that of the SSM as an experimentalist organization. This can integrate and recast key elements of the other 2 views into a more complete and dynamic analysis of the SSM's evolving architecture and practical operations. What I do in the paper is to analyze the evolution and functioning of the SSM's organizational practices, decision-making processes, and institutional structures from the beginning in 2014 to the present. It's based not only on extensive documentary analysis, but also on 25 in-depth interviews with 40 key officials from the ECB, the NCAs, but also the European Banking Authority and the Commission. Okay, let me start with the first view of the SSM as a centralized hierarchy. It's widely considered, I think rightly, to mark a major step beyond networked agencies towards supranationalization of EU financial regulation. As many of you, I assume, know, it's a single supranational supervisor for Eurozone banks with final authority over granting and withdrawing banking licenses. So that's the power of life and death over banks. The ECB directly supervises now the 115 or so largest, most significant banks in the Eurozone, and it can take over supervision of so-called less significant institutions from the national authorities where necessary. It's committed, in its own words, to intrusive, hands-on oversight of significant institutions through joint supervisory teams of ECB and national officials. These are supported by numerous on-site inspection missions and central benchmarking. It's created a very detailed and prescriptive set of manuals and guides and guidance documents to promote harmonization and convergence of supervisory approaches. And it's also sought to develop joint supervisory standards to steer and harmonize national supervision of less significant institutions. So here are just a few of the points that would support this, this view of the SSM as a centralized hierarchy. Now I want to present the second view of the SSM as a polyarchic network. All its major decisions must be approved by the supervisory board, where the national competent authorities account for 21 of 27 votes. I'm not sure how widely recognized that is. And as a result, all of its major initiatives and policies are in fact developed through a dense web of networks and working groups and drafting teams involving both the ECB and the national authorities. In fact, the ECB has never used its power to take over supervision of less significant institutions from the NCAs, and it explicitly prefers co-development of joint supervisory standards with the NCAs to binding instruments which it considers slow and difficult to change. The ECB doesn't directly employ or control the numerous NCA staff involved both in off-site and on-site supervision of large banks through the joint supervisory teams and inspection missions. The NCAs retain an independent voice on EU banking regulation through the European Banking Authority, in which the ECB participates but doesn't get to vote. And so if we take those features, we can see that if we look more closely, the institutional design of the SSM encourages a cooperative rather than a hierarchical approach by the ECB to joint supervision with the NCAs. Now I come to my third perspective, the SSM as an experimentalist organization. And here I draw on a broader body of work that I and colleagues have been doing on experimentalist governance as a recursive process of provisional goal setting and rulemaking and revision based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience in different local contexts. And in its most developed form, experimentalist governance typically involves a cycle of functional steps organized as an iterative multi-level architecture. I'll flash you a picture of this, and underpinned by what we call penalty defaults to sanction non-cooperation. Importantly, in some cases, under conditions of high interdependence, concern for the integrity of integrated markets has led to the creation of a single set of harmonized but provisional rules, revisable through ongoing review of implementation experience. This is a sort of simplified experimentalist architecture. Here, I'm going to flash the classic model with of experimentalist governance as an iterative multi-level architecture with 4 steps. We can return to this in the discussion if people are interested. Now, compared to that architecture, the SSM clearly diverges in important respects. Rather than setting open-ended framework goals and giving lower level national or subnational actors substantial autonomy to pursue them in ways adapted to their own local circumstances, the SSM, as I mentioned already, has developed increasingly detailed and prescriptive rules and methods which banking supervisors are expected to apply as consistently as possible across jurisdictions. But within these limits, my study of the SSM in action, I think, reveals the centrality to its organization of experimentalist practices of learning from diversity, peer review, and continuous revision based on local implementation experience. And if we ask why, the adoption of these practices flows directly from the SSM's deliberate efforts to adapt its rules, methods, and procedures to banks' diverse business models on the one hand, and constantly to update them in response to the uncertainties created by rapidly changing markets and technologies on the other. So here again, as with the other two perspectives, let me just give you some stylized facts to support this view. First of all, it very explicitly seeks to accommodate banking diversity by tailoring common rules and methods to firm specificities. Second, the design of the whole SSM supervisory model was very explicitly the outcome of joint deliberation and comparison of national practices by mixed ECB and NCA teams. And we could say the same thing for the functioning of the JSTs themselves. We see a very elaborate capillary system of ongoing peer review and benchmarking within and between the JSTs, the on-site supervisors, and the various ECB divisional networks. The SSM seeks to engage in forward-looking supervision. It aims at identifying prudential risks and threats to financial stability rather than looking backwards towards audited accounts. And as a result, the manuals and guides are, again, very explicitly regarded as living documents subject to continuous review and improvements in light of implementation experience, but also of new developments. And very importantly, the frontline supervisors can and regularly do propose revisions to rules, procedures, and methodologies based on their local application. So let me conclude. First, the SSM case, I would argue, shows that even the most advanced forms of EU governance continue to be characterized by experimentalism, despite some centralized hierarchical features. One reason for this is the polyarchic structure of the EU itself, in which member states participate directly in its decision-making processes. And we see that embodied in the SSM's functioning. A second reason is the functional challenge of combining central coordination with local knowledge and regularly updating rules and policies in response to uncertain and rapidly changing environments. And this is really the key scope condition for experimentalist governance, that is what we call strategic uncertainty. Finally, the SSM case also shows that under conditions of high interdependence, harmonized rules and supervisory practices can be effective and acceptable to member states, provided they're applied in contextually sensitive ways and regularly revised through local implementation experience. And arguably, despite the differences in the nature of the policy problem, this provides some positive hopes for completion and improvement of the other pillars of banking union. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. We will move forward to Elsa, and she will talk about too big to fail banks and what the ECB is doing about them. So.
Okay, so thank you, Sandra and Vincent, for organizing the workshop and for inviting me. And also, I must apologize because due to health-related issues, I didn't come as prepared as I should have or wanted to. So today I'm presenting a paper that is part of a bigger project, and which is entitled Large Banks in the ECB's Eyes, From Curse to Blessing, and hopefully with a quite explicit subtitle, Tracing the Diffusion of the Blessing ID from National Finance Ministries to the ECB Executive Council, passing by national central bankers through discourse analysis. So here on these graphs, you can see the number of mentions toward large banks as curse or blessing in speeches of European central bankers. So here in these graphs are included the members of the executive board and the governors of the national central banks. On the left, it's based on the speeches gathered in the from the Bank of International Settlements database. So basically, I've web scraped all the speeches of European central bankers. There were over 3,000 of them. I pulled out extracts about large banks, and I manually coded these extracts. So when they were referring to large banks as a risk for financial stability or as a too big to fail I coded it as a curse. And when they were referring to large banks as a boon for competitiveness or as a need for further consolidation, I coded it as blessing. So here in the whole sample, you can see that there is a clear trend, and we'll see how this breaks down within the ECB a little bit later. So at the beginning of the period, so right after the crisis, it's mostly like the curse mentions, and then little by little, you see the blessing mentions increasing. On the right, it's the same exercise that I've done, but only based on interviews that I could find in newspapers on the Factiva database. So it's overlapping, but not only, because here you can find some reactions to specific regulation from central bankers. And here the trend is even more obvious. So to give you just an illustration of what I mean, so let's read the first quote. So when it's a curse, for instance, this quote, from a public policy perspective, this is unacceptable. No institution should be too big to fail. If they are too big to fail, they are too big to exist. And then the blessing position, it would be good to see two strong banks come together, maybe in a cross-border merger that would have many advantages. So this evolution has triggered resistance or even surprise among regulators and bankers. So for instance, we have to reject the tempting idea that the ECB supervision means that giant banks no longer pose systemic risk. And here you have a quote from the chief executive of Crédit Agricole. There has been 10 years of regulators pushing us to be smaller and more simple, and now Draghi and Nui are saying it is time to have consolidation in the banks. There is a break between the sounds and the pictures, and the picture here. So this paper engages with the literature on the developing literature on the ECB preferences and policies. I'm not going through it. And also on the literature, it engages with the literature on the relationships between national policymakers and supranational regulators and integration. So the question that I'm trying to answer is what explains the change in the position of the ECB towards large bank from curse to blessing. And the research question of the specific paper is where did the blessing position started and was developed first, and how it has been diffused. And it's part of a bigger project that kind of shows that different state agencies, so ministries of finance, parliaments, regulators at different levels have different priorities toward bankings, and that banking policies and priorities result largely from conflicts within the states, among state agencies. So the methods, and so one important aspect for this project is to trace the discourses toward banking in different state agencies and see how they diffuse to other state agencies or not. And here it's between the national and the European level. And what I've shown is that the blessing position toward large banks has been developed within ministries of finance, like right after the crisis. And it's not a blessing position of any kind. It's really arguing that large banks are good for national economic sovereignty. And this sovereignty argument is not developed by other actors. It's really started within the ministries of finance. So here I do an analysis of actors' discourses. Sorry, I don't know why it does that. It does that all the time. Discourses and their diffusion across time. So the first finding of the paper is that the sovereignty argument was developed within ministries of finance immediately after the 2008 crisis. And it has diffused to the ECB executive board through national central bankers. The second finding is that the executive council members picked on the sovereignty position right after the creation of the SSM. And the third finding is that while the ministries of finance of large member states with large banks all developed the sovereignty arguments, only French and Italian national central bankers relayed the argument within the ECB. So here you can see. So here you can see the curse and blessing mentions, but just within the ECB Executive Council members before and after the SSM. And the graph speaks for itself. The change in the position towards large bank was big and really quick among ECB Executive Board members. Before 2013, it's only the curse position, and then the blessing position becomes even dominant within the Executive Board. So this change is coherent with the spillover theory. Integration of supervision fosters preferences for further market integration. And it's observed that in the discourses of central banker after the creation of the SSM, they're really pushing for cross-border mergers and more consolidation really on behalf of integration. So here you can see, for instance, cross-border mergers would deepen integration. It would increase consolidations, will make us reach, the integration of the banking markets. But importantly for this paper and for my arguments, there is another dimension in the new blessing position of the ECB towards large banks. It is that they are perceived as an instrument of sovereignty and competitiveness. And so they're referring to large banks as blessing, but also because they are larger banks would be able to compete with larger global peers. They are comparing European banks to international competitors and referring to them as a matter of national sovereignty. And this sovereignty position was developed within the ministries of finance of large member states. Interestingly, not in the European Parliament or EU Commission, and not even in banks' lobbying arguments right after the crisis. So ministries of finance conceive of their large banks as a dimension of national sovereignty. Here I pulled out a quote from the French finance minister, Pierre Moscovici at that time, where he was referring to the French banks as a question of financing the economy, but also of sovereignty. And here it's the mentions of large banks in parliamentary debates when ministers of finance are speaking, and you can see with the orange line that they're referring to large banks as a question of competitiveness/sovereignty. They're bringing up this argument really right after the crisis, even though right after the crisis, the systemic risk mentioned is higher than the competitiveness. But you can see this argument from the very start of the period within ministries of finance, as compared to other regulators where there were no mention of these arguments. And you can see in this graph that national central bankers have relayed the blessing position within the ECB before the Executive Council members made it their own after the adoption of the SSM. Here you can see it's the number of blessing mentions in the speeches, and in green are Italian and French national central bankers. And these are using this position toward large banks since early on, and then it's taken up by the council, the executive board members. Interestingly, not the German central bankers, who have remained really focused on the systemic risk position toward large banks, even though the sovereignty arguments has also been developed in the German Ministry of Finance. So to conclude, when the SSM was created, the ECB executive members made their own position considering large banks as an instrument of European economic sovereignty / competitiveness. And this position was developed within national ministries of finance early on and was diffused within the ECB by mostly French and Italian national central bankers. And thank you.
Great, thank you for this interesting presentation. I see raised hands and already some comments in the chat section, so we will discuss this after the comments. We still have one presentation left by Sandra on the European Banking Union as a case of differentiated integration. So the last presentation for today, again, 10 to 12 minutes. Let's go.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm aware I'm now really, it's being late, so I'm trying to stick to time. And please, Christian, let me know if I'm over time. So the title of my paper is The European Banking Union, and I discuss it from the angle of differentiated integration, but I also discuss other paths of integration in the paper. And as those of you who have seen the paper, apologies, of course, to the virtual audience who have not seen the papers. It is work in progress, which involves a sector comparison. So it also talks about electricity, but in my paper, I will focus on banking. So this is drawing, and these are the acknowledgements on the previous project when SAFE was still a Löwe Center, and I had a project which was a comparison of the two unions, the energy union and the banking union. It is also a project which is a joint endeavor, and I think that's important to know in the single market integration Vista network, because we prepare a special issue, and some of the aspects I'm discussing are sort of a collective work. And I know that the editors, or some of them, are in the audience, so this welcome to you as well. So this is great to know, and I'm currently based in Aarhus. So the research question is, in a way, an easy one, but also a difficult one, because it is about the effect of certain institutional arrangements, governance arrangements, on policy outcomes. And as you know, we as political scientists, we are often a bit shy to tackle that question, but in the special issue, we are trying to tackle the question. We are really looking at single market integration dynamics in different areas and over time, which is not easy. So all of your comments are really helpful in that respect. So I proceed in two steps that I really look at first, which is a bit sort of the easier part for a political scientist. I look at the institutional evolution, also try to explain it, conceptualize it, and then I discuss the effects of governance. And I think this could, especially the second part, could potentially still be improved. Now, the theories and concepts, this is quite rich in the paper, and I'm aware that we have a very knowledgeable audience on the European Banking Union, so I think I do not need to explain so much about the empirical case, but rather might spend a bit more time on these political science theories. So I combine three things. First of all, I applied historical institutional theory about gradual change. So in a way, it's sort of this incrementalism that has been mentioned by Matthias Goldman previously, that we think of change not so much in the big moments, but rather sort of as a gradual process over time. And as some of you surely are aware, Mahoney and Thielen have tried to theorize that and conceptualize that, speak of displacement as the removal of existing rules and the introduction of new ones, layering, which is very typical, of course, in the multi-level system of the EU, where you have introduction of new rules on top of old rules. We've seen that with many agencies, where networks become agencies, where, of course, agencies draw on the national level and so on. Conversion is the changed enactment of existing rules due to so that they are strategically redeployed. And drift is sort of more driven by the circumstances that the existing rules have changed in impact. So especially for the first three, there's a strong aspect really of agency, that actors' abilities to take advantage of opportunities to promote their preferred outcome are important. Furthermore, I engage not only with the concept of differentiated integration, which has been very prominently discussed and applied to the European Banking Union, but also other areas. Schimmelpfennig, for instance, has written a paper on this 2016. But I also look at covered integration. So differentiated integration, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, it means that you have varying levels of integration, either geographically, as we know, EMU, not all EU states are in, or banking union, or that you have variation across policy areas. Again, EMU, economic, much weaker than the monetary integration. Covered integration, or integration by stealth, as it has been called by Mayone, is about renegotiating a specificity of rules or institutions outside the formal political decision-making arena. So, of course, by courts, but also central banks or regulators. So it's often hidden integration, but can be quite important. Another term which is still different, and I think that would also speak to Jonathan's account of the SSM, is the idea of a segmented order, or segments as networks and recurring patterns of interaction which involve a wide range of actors, including private actors who share policy perception. That's a term used by Batora and Fossum 2019. So, and the important thing about the segmented order, this is why it's called segmented, is that then policy areas sort of coexist, and they are only partially linked to the major political decision-making arena. And I think obviously this is also relevant for many very specific areas of regulation. Now, I try to be brief on the three types of outcomes which we discuss in the special issue, so all of us, which is resilience as a sort of absence of change, but also sort of stability. So it can mean adaptation, but only to the extent to sort of uphold the status quo. We can have renewed integration, of course, as we have just discussed and during the previous talk, or we could also see even renationalization, so that supranational rules are suspended, not implemented, or that projects are being abandoned, integration projects. So we have two hypotheses in the special issue, and I focus on this first one, which is again, in a way, about the centralization argument, about a bit weaker here, about the existence of a coordination body, and we argue that the existence of an institutionalized coordination body in the multi-level governance architecture promotes resilience in or furthers EU single market integration. We also have a second hypothesis, which I show here, but I won't discuss it now for the interest of time. But of course, I'm happy to have fully fledged comments of yours if you have read the paper and have some thoughts on this. And now the expectations for the first hypothesis, I would expect indeed that we could see three modes of institutional change. Once we create such a coordination body, we can create a new coordination body, that would be displacement. We can see a layering, that existing structures are reinforced, or we could also see that an existing body takes on a different task, which would be conversion. In terms of paths of integration, of course, oftentimes when we create new structures, it is only applying to certain policy fields. I mean, that's even typical in the case of delegation, so you could even speak of differentiation in that sense, but it also often applies only to certain member states or their opt-outs. But we also see covered integration and segmented order. I mean, covered integration, because once you shift competencies towards somehow supranational body, of course, that oftentimes develops its own dynamics, but at the same time, as also Diane shows, with the still very important national layer and also the regulated industry, we also have all kinds of networks and actors involved in these segments. And in the integration outcome, according to the hypothesis, of course, would be the two things, but not renationalization, because these coordination bodies would be expected to sort of be a sort of guarantee for a certain progress in that area. Now, I'll be relatively brief on the banking case. I mean, we know that it has been mentioned in the previous presentation. Initially, sort of the path was one of layering, one could say. So it was really developing from very loose cooperation. Then we had the committees, and then we had these European supervisory authorities and the European Banking Authority, of course, created in the context of the great financial crisis. But we also had an additional institutional development architecture with the European Banking Union and then the ECB, a single supervisor, and sort of this discontinuation of a previous path of institutional evolution, as you are all familiar with. When we look now at financial market integration, and this is one sort of index I've chosen now, which is sort of the sub-index for the banking market, we see, and I think this is very much also common sense amongst the policy experts I've interviewed, but also what you can often hear and read, is that despite EMU and despite EBU, or maybe because of EMU, I mean, I'm also referring to Lucia's and David's work here, who have this argument about one money, two markets, we see that it's not really going that well. I mean, here in this index, we say it goes massively down in May 2008, sort of throughout the financial crisis, and it slowly picks up. So at least we don't really see that financial market integration is really thriving. So in a way, these coexisting bodies have not led to renewed integration. That's my major point that of financial markets, but only in the area really of supervision in a way. And so in terms of paths of integration, this differentiated integration could contribute to that, I think, and that's also an argument that has been made by Howard and Quaglia. But I think it's also reinforced, of course, by covered integration, by these new bodies being created. So that would speak to our hypothesis. And I wonder whether to some extent the segmented order could even help to overcome that. And that would be sort of part of my conclusion, because I think I'm running out of time. Is that correct? I'm always really bad at watching the time. So in terms of conclusions, it's, I think, two major conclusions regarding the banking case. That is there not a tension, or still research questions for all of us, is there not a tension between policy goals, between supervision versus market integration? That could also be maybe speaking to Elsa's paper. I was just thinking according to these categories, and differentiated integration reinforced by covered integration does certainly not help, but maybe the segmentic orders also across levels could help to overcome these problems. And in terms of contribution, I think it's really a very sort of rich paper in terms of concepts. It seeks to link different strands of the literature. That is, of course, also a risk. So maybe there are also suggestions to streamline it a bit. And there's also the effort to try and use the integration theories to explain market dynamics. And I think I stop here and look forward to your comments, suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you everybody for these four very interesting presentations. Interestingly, all four make an argument about their research on the banking sector in Europe has something to say about like the European modes of governance in general. So the discussion about like, let's say, banking union is not very much technical, specific one, but also quite important for the general scope of our discussions. But before we get into the final round of hard discussing, Lucia will give some food for thought on the papers and presentations that we just heard. So let's Yeah, tell us what you think about those.
Thank you. So I very much enjoyed reading the 4 papers. They fit well together and also they speak to each other. So I shall discuss them according to the order in which they were presented. So I shall start with Jonathan's paper. Now, my comments on this paper are quite brief for 2 reasons. The first one is that the paper is really very much polished up and is almost ready for submission, if not already submitted. So in a sense, it would be difficult for me to comment, but also the second reason is that I had the opportunity to discuss Jonathan's paper in a different panel a couple of weeks ago. So it was difficult for me to come up with different comments, but also I am in a way repeating my comments for the benefits of the audience, but not because I was not fully persuaded by Jonathan's answer or reply to my comments. So in a sense, that's why I am in a way reiterating the comment, but the answer were absolutely convincing. I also want to emphasize, this is really a very rich paper. It's really great interview material, and the way in which the interviews were conducted, also the material presented. So it's really great field work. So 3 comments very quickly. The first one is about maybe beefing up the theoretical discussion of the 3 models. And in particular, maybe to come up with some empirical expectations that can be teased out from the 3 models and then can be well applied. I don't like the word tested against the empirical record, or at least to get the reader a sense of what would be confirming or disconfirming evidence. Second comment is that the experimentalist model is the one that seems to explain the most in the paper. And I was wondering whether it might be worth spelling out if that's the case. Maybe it's not the case. With some scope condition or under what circumstances maybe one of the other 2 models has better explanatory power, or if that's not the case, then the comment doesn't apply. The third comment is, and I was fully persuaded by the answer that Jonathan gave me, but I think I will still, in a sense, make it, was about the interview material. So, that's really great stuff, and, interview policymakers, in particular market supervisors in the SSM and national competent authorities, which are part of it. And my comment was whether central bankers in general, but also banking supervisors, they tend to underplay conflicts, in particular when they ask to comment on those, speaking to academics or external observers. So in a sense, whether maybe there was a little bit more attrition between the center, the ECB, and the national competent authorities, that the interviewees were willing or inclined to report. And so how to deal with this issue? Well, first of all, I wouldn't recommend more interviews. I mean, that's a very impressive list. Maybe one way to deal with this would be not to interview industry practitioners, but maybe at least look whether there is only the responses to consultation they give to a different EU proposal, or whatever. There are occasionally also discussion about reforming the existing framework. Whether anyway that there is, we cross-check the interview, not necessarily with interviews with the private sector, but at least what is public available in terms of position paper, responses to consultation, and so on. And okay, and I think I shall stop here with reference to Jonathan's paper, and I'm sure he will give me the very convincing answer to this last point he gave me the last time. So, but I don't want to preempt his answer. So, second paper is by Diane Fromage. So that's a very rich paper, and it seems to be that in particular in the paper, not so much in the presentation, there are different papers, plural, in it. So it's the kind of paper that you can take in different directions. And then for a book project, it is good to have different research questions. But then for a paper, my suggestion would be to narrow down your research question. Also because some of the research questions you identify, they would require somewhat research design. One is what I would call the top-down research design. So what are the effects of the creation of the SSM on the national competent authorities in the member states? But then some of the other questions actually have to do with the accountability of the SSM. So just to give an indication of what I mean, the initial overarching question is how much the institutional design as it is currently stands in Germany and Italy was driven by EU reforms and how much was instead nationally induced. But then in the paper, you have several sub-questions. They are quite different. So the sub-questions are, what are the specific consequences of the creation of the banking union for the national competent authorities? Is their influence significantly reduced, though in the view they take? What are the implications of the additional transfer of competencies to the European Union level in terms of administrative, democratic, and judicial accountability? And is the single supervisory system, as it exists in Germany, still the most adapted to the SSM model, or is there evidence that a functional divide is better? So key point is, for the purpose of a self-contained paper, maybe to narrow down the research question, or questions, but at least they take it one perspective, either top-down or bottom-up. And second point, as a political scientist, I understand that the paper is rooted in the legal literature, maybe to justify a bit more the choice of the comparison and the criteria for the comparison. Of course, Italy and Germany are large countries, but then, in a sense, to say a little bit more why these two countries and the national competent authority were selected for the comparison. And then final point is the perhaps consider the possibility of inserting a theoretical framework or research design part after the introduction. So I am aware this is mostly a comment coming from a political scientist perspective. Political economy maybe is less common in the legal literature, but that was sort of something that I would have liked to see. And final point, which is related to this last one, is that I felt sometimes politics was also missing from the narrative. And the related one, but it's not exactly the same kind of comment, is that it seems to me the paper really very much looks at the institutional change, the formal institutional one. And I was thinking, for example, in the case of the Bank of Italy, on the one hand, yes, it is maybe more independent than it was before from the Ministry of the Treasury, in the sense that no longer whatever sits in the Comitato Interministeriale. But at the same time, in terms of substantial change, these are national supervisors, which in the past were the only supervisors of national banks. And now they have to share their competencies with the ECB. So to me, sort of is a major institutional change in terms of their competencies. In that respect, they are very much reduced, but at the very least share between two levels. Good. I then will move to Elsa's paper. Also, that's a very nice paper because it covers a blind spot in the literature, which is about what is the ECB position on too big to fail banks, and also how it has evolved over time and why this is the case. And the answer that Elsa gives is that there was a shift from a criticism, a critique of banks which were too big to fail, to the support for the formation of large banks or mega banks. And the explanation for this is due to the influence of the Italian and French central bankers, in particular the governing council and executive board. And then if you want a step before that, that's due to the influence or review of the treasury ministers and ministries in France and Italy, which then persuade, influence their national central bankers sitting at governing council and executive board, and then the ECB change its view on this matter. Now, 3 points of this. The first one is a methodological question about recording of speeches, but it's quite important because I was wondering, it is quite important to decide how to code these speeches, and in particular, what, for example, wording count as a support for too big to fail banks. So, for example, because I'm not sure I was able to express myself well, the 3 instances that you report in slide 3 and 8 of your PowerPoint as examples of blessing of too big to fail given by the ECB, I'm not sure they could or should be interpreted in this way. To me, these were statements that reported or expressed support for cross-border banks to end financial nationalism, but support for cross-border banks, for the formation of cross-border banks, it doesn't really, it's not really equal to the support for the too big to fail, which to my mind are either globally systemically important banks or even nationally systemically important banks. So that's quite important, because I just wonder whether some of the speeches are more support for cross-border mergers rather than really the creation of too big to fail mega banks. Second point is about the explanation for the preferences of the finance ministers in France and Italy. And to me, the explanation for the Italian treasury ministries, it's a bit obscure, in the sense that in France, the banking system comprises, I think it's 4 banks which are too big to fail, and indeed also they're included in the list of globally systemically important institutions, 3 of them. Whereas in the Italian banking system, it is actually much less concentrated. The 5 largest Italian banks, they have about 50% of the domestic market shares, which means the remaining 50% is actually belongs to small and medium-sized banks. So why would the Italian finance ministry and the Bank of Italy have a soft spot for mega banks? Now, the answer might well be because at one point, the 2 large Italian banks, Unicredit and Intesa, became very successful in lobbying the Italian ministry. But to me, that's a preference that is difficult to explain, and then it's important in order to corroborate your argument. I should also add that in the past, small and medium-sized banks in Italy had good access and good, if you want, a sympathetic hearing from the treasuries and also the treasury ministry in Italy and the Bank of Italy. So this shift of the treasury and the Bank of Italy in favor of mega banks at least needs to be explained. And final point is whether there is a potential internal contradiction in the argument, in the sense that the sovereignty argument, it doesn't sit entirely well with the support for the formation of cross-border banks, unless we interpret the sovereignty argument in terms of Euro or European Union level sovereignty, and in which case maybe it could fit with the support of cross-border banks. And final curiosity, why were the French and Italian central bankers more pliable to the preferences or to take on board the concern of their finance ministries, whereas other central bankers or other central banks didn't do so? Okay, how much do we have time? Quickly, Sandra, papers. So and here very quickly, 3 comments. Again, let me reiterate for all the 4 papers, they are great. I very much enjoyed them. So maybe I didn't repeat this phrase for all the papers, but it applies to all of them. So first comment, whether it might be possible also to include some alternative or complementary explanation. Now, the paper has a qualification of this. So I think it basically says that because of the research design, this is not advisable or possible, but still, potentially reviewers can make all sorts of comments, but one of them is then have you considered alternative explanation or complementary explanation? Second comment is similar to the one I made with reference to the Jan, in terms of justifying a bit better the selection of the case studies, not so much country studies in this case, but why the electricity sector and the banking sector. Final point has to do with the, well, actually there are 2 points, but I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. So let me look at the chair, whether I am exceeding my time. Okay, good. So research design, for me personally, there was a lot of going on in terms of conceptual framework. So there were a lot of potentially overlapping concepts. So there are types of institutional change, namely displacement, layering, conversion, and drift. There are parts of European integration, namely covert integration, differentiated integration, segmented orders. And then there are outcomes resulting from gradual change, resilience, renationalization, and renewed integration. So I was just wondering whether it would be possible to streamline the conceptual part. Final point is about the formulation and operationalization of hypotheses. So hypothesis 1 reads the existing of an institutionalized coordination body in the multi-level governance architecture promotes resilience in a further European Union single market integration. And then the paper gives as an example the role of the Commission in competition policy, which is one of the policy areas in which the Commission has most power. But then I was thinking, taking a sort of more historical view, but this was a case in which there was also partial renationalization of competition policy in, well, I can't recall exactly when, about a decade ago. So how does the centralized policy area hypothesis fit with outcomes in which there is actually a renationalization, there is not further single market integration? Final point with the second hypothesis, which reads the presence of public and private interactions in a multi-level governance architecture promotes resilience in or further the European Union single market integration. And here, as a sort of as a financial political economy expert, I was thinking, well, but cases in which there was a lot of public-private interaction in finance, in particular prior to the global financial crisis, that's something that didn't promote at all the resilience of the financial system and the financial stability. So I was thinking how to sort of solve this puzzle. So that's all from me. And if this is useful, I could also send privately my comments, because I am aware that I speak quite quickly, also in the interest of economizing time. So I shall stop here.
Great, thank you very much for these very insightful comments. And I guess, like everyone all of the 4 presenters benefit from them. So we still have like 15 minutes. We have quite some comments and questions in the chat already, mostly about the presentations of Elsa and Jan. So we have this already, let's say, on board. So I would like to give the opportunity for raised hands and also for the audience to raise a question in the Q&A. So I'll start with Matthias, who raised his hand already like half an hour ago.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a very quick question to Elsa. It's this blessing narrative is 30 years old. You start in 2009. The simple question of mine is, what's the position of the ECB pre-2008 on too big to fail banks? And my prediction is they love it. It's just my prediction, can be completely wrong there. But, and I mean, you know the paper by Leblond and Grossman, or Grossman and Leblond 2011. So that you know what I'm referring to. Thank you.
Great. Paul.
Hi there. Yeah, also, I'll try to keep my question also very brief. So with many of the papers, I really love the papers, but I'm wondering, and maybe I ask you stuff that goes beyond the purpose of the paper, I understand, but still I'm really interested. And for some of the papers, I'm really wondering what to make of it. And so, for example, Diane, Elsa, and also Sandra. So is it good or is it bad? So, for example, with supervision, do we want diversity in how national competent authorities supervise? It could be beneficial, for example, in the sense that Jonathan seemed to suggest that perhaps there's a good role for experimentation. In the case of Elsa, I also wonder, blessing, is it a blessing because now there is control, the authorities think they have control over the banks? Could it be a behavioral bias? So I'm not so, I mean, disentangling national and European influence is interesting, but I'm also wondering, is it good to have that diversity in approaches? And I think it's a question that speaks to many of the papers, which were all very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more raised hands? Otherwise, I would like to ask those who raised some questions or in the chat whether they want to come up with these issues again. I have on the list Sandra, Francesco, Vincent, and Andreas, and yeah, Jonathan partly. So any of you who wants to make a point? Francesco? Yes.
Yeah, so no, my question was in part asked by Lucia as well, but I would like just to bring the focus once again on the issue of sovereignty. Indeed, I think there is some sort of contradiction in what Elsa was arguing in her paper. You cannot have simultaneously a process that leads to more national sovereignty via big banks and simultaneously wanting very large cross-border multinational banks. So I'm not sure whether are we talking about a double movement of sovereignty where we still want sovereignty, but we're switching from national sovereignty to some sort of undefined EU-wide sovereignty, or whether the European level argument is just an excuse to go back and do what we were doing before the global financial crisis. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you could comment on this.
So we could collect like 1 or 2 more questions.
Thank you. I apologize because I had to step out in some of it, so I haven't seen the full panel. But one of the questions from the earlier session was resonating with me as I was listening to and reading the papers. And that's the question of integration theory. And so Sandra asked the question before, and I think throughout all these papers, our question is becoming, what do we actually expect in terms of the progress of integration? So if we think about functionalism, we're in that big, somebody called about Renaissance or Enlightenment thinking about integration, that it's sort of a big bang visionary thing. And we have a view of maybe it needs to be federal. We get there in steps when sort of the policy fails as well for optimization to be achieved and so on. So that's sort of one logic, right? For which we have like 40 years of literature, or at least attempt at, and then giving up on it and so on. And now we've been talking about sort of institutional, gradual, and sort of steps that are taken because there really isn't that big vision. If there were, there's this problem of politicization, legitimacy, democracy, and the lack of clarity about whether this is something that maybe some, like through referendums and small groups who can sort of put their foot down and say, we don't like this because we don't trust and all these things, which is a chicken and egg, right? You need a public space for public debate in order to make a demos in a sense of all being part of a debate in order to politicize. But before you have it, it's really hard to build it. So if we think of our endeavor to improve governance at the EU level through doing things together, the bigger question is how does this all sit in the overall field of where you can move things forward? So my long-winded question is to ask maybe the panelists to reflect on how their research suggests the logical steps one might expect in integration. Is this something that is more systemic and broad, visionary? Is it something that may be incremental? What are some of the circumstances that one would need to see in order to move from this sort of more incremental to the big picture item? Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So yes, I'd like to encourage especially Diane, Elsa, and also Sandra, because those are the presenters that received some more or some less comments and questions in the chat, to have a look at it and think about it, perhaps like answer it or discuss it perhaps tomorrow, because it might be a bit late for those who are in Europe here. So, and I would like to give opportunity to the presenters to quickly respond, like 2 minutes each, on some of the points. You don't have to cover all of those. You can also like extend it to tomorrow. Also on any points you like to respond the most. So we start with Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let me start with Paul's question. Do we want continued national diversity in supervision as promoting experimentation? I think that the single supervisory mechanism is a distinctive institution, although there are parallels, emerging parallels in other fields, because we see a very high level, and we have a lot of diversity on the one hand, but strong functional needs for a uniform set of rules and practices at any given moment. And for three reasons: to prevent regulatory arbitrage, to create a level playing field and ensure equal treatment for banks, and thirdly, to promote banking market integration, even though, as Sandra points out, that is lagging behind. And so what I think we see is a very effective institutional structure in which you have this really intensive cooperation between the national and European supervisors in making policy, designing rules and methods, and so on. But there's an effort to apply them in a very consistent way across territories. And the focus on diversity is not so much on national banking markets, although those are taken into account, but on adapting supervision to the specificities of different kinds of banks and their business model. So what's important here is also the continuous feedback and revision of the rules, methods, standards, etc., based on the implementation experience. And so this is where the national diversity feeds back in and promotes experimentation. So it's an interesting question, vis-a-vis Amy's comments, to think about whether and to what extent this can be a model for other areas of integration. I think probably paradoxically, the area where we might see some parallels for the future is going to be migration and asylum policy, because that is the only other area where you really are developing this implementation and enforcement capacity at the European level. And it will, if you look at the design of Frontex or the proposed European asylum agency, they will also work with mixed teams of European and national officials. So that's interesting. Let me just respond very briefly to Lucia's comments, which, as she says, we've discussed before. I should say that I also had nice comments from Matthias and from Sandra at previous presentations. So the paper that you see is really kind of two papers in one which is about experimentalism and differentiated integration, and the other is really about experimentalist versus centralized hierarchical governance. And the reason that's the case is because it was written for a project on differentiated integration. I have come to the conclusion that is not the most interesting dimension of banking union or the SSM, and I intend to refocus the paper for publication around the theoretical relationship between experimentalism and hierarchical governance and the scope conditions for them. And what I would say is that there are three important scope conditions. One is the most important is strategic uncertainty. The second is a polyarchic distribution of power. And the third is interdependence among the actors. And so, in a sense, if you have intensive polyarchy and strategic uncertainty, centralized hierarchical governance is not very applicable. If you have a combination of high levels of interdependence and polyarchy, then you start to get what I've called this kind of networked cooperation. But if you add strategic uncertainty, then you get the full experimentalist dimension. But if you combine that with the high levels of interdependence, then you get this simplified, as I call it, experimentalist architecture, which combines synchronic uniformity with diachronic experimentalism. I would like to set that up theoretically in the more upfront in a revised version of the paper, and use that to organize the presentation of the three perspectives. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we still have like 1 minute, but we might run a bit over. Let's keep the answers short. Diane, you're next.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Christian. I start with Paul's question about, is it good or is it bad? And I think that relates also to Sandra's question in the chat about LSIs and etc. And to Jonathan's findings in terms of experimentalist governance. And my answer is, I think it's bad that we have so much, diversity, etc. But I would argue it's inevitable. Just because, of the lack of harmonization. And I think that's where, the experimentalization is coming from, in the sense that we have so little harmonization at the EU level, despite those, competencies having been attributed to the ECB, for instance, that there is no other way to just try and do something. So I think, it's not satisfactory, but as long as we don't have an overhaul reform of the rules, especially in terms of the divide between European Union, so EU 27, Euro area, and European Banking Union. I think there is no way we go beyond this. And maybe as a second point, if I can still react to Lucia's very rich comments. So thanks very much for this. And that's also related to Jonathan's question in the chat. I think my biggest problem with this paper, which is going to be, like I said, on the one hand, a habilitation thesis, but I think also another research project in the form of articles that will then look at the multi-level dimension and the EU dimension. I think I need to split those, because if I now bring into the EU elements on the national institutions, then the project is never going to end. But it's good to get your comments, especially Lucia, about the different research questions. Thanks again.
Great. Elsa.
Okay, so very quickly, I had a lot of questions. But thank you, Lucia. It's a really good comments and question. So what counts on support for too big to fail banks? So there are two issues. The first is there is this argument that now large banks are no longer too big to fail, right? We've increased, decreased their systemic importance. So that would be, I think, I don't buy this argument. If you look at, banks' balance sheets. And the second one is that it's not only about merging huge banks, but also merging smaller banks, which is true. But when you look at what they're talking about, when they say about, Europe having European banks able to compete with international lenders, international competitors, they're not talking about mergers between two saving banks. So I think there is really, it doesn't mean that it's only large banks, but the large banks that are positioning themselves on the cross-border consolidation process are not like saving banks. They are the huge, too big to fail European banks. On your second question, the preference of ministries of finance, it's really, it's something that I'm really interested in, and I'm been doing this project. And something that is not varying across European countries with large banks is the support of finance ministries for their large banks. It's not in this even considering the fact that the market is less concentrated, or that even local banks have also access to ministries of finance. So here it needs to be explained, and I completely agree with you. I'm trying to develop this idea that ministries of finance have come to conceive of their large banks as an instrument of national sovereignty and competitiveness, and that they are really linking having a global bank to state power. So that's another project. About the sovereignty argument, so there were two comments. It's not, for me, it's not at all contradictory. So you have a European playing field. They are starting to when the regulation is integrated. There are some regulators that are starting to think about sovereignty at the European level, and the national level is really also positioning themselves to become the representative of the European sovereignty. So being a national champion, being a European champion, it's even better. So when you talk about when you talk with French regulators or French bankers, of course they are considering themselves European, the representative of European sovereignty, and the European champion. So it's not, I don't see them at all as contradictory. And about, sorry, okay, sorry. Yes.
So, thanks. So final words by Sandra, 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks so much. I know we are over time already, so I really try to be brief. So Lucia, thank you so much for all these very helpful comments. I will also pass them on to the editors, especially I find your takes on the hypothesis. Of course, we also are happy with disconfirming the hypothesis, and we had clearly the idea that the second hypothesis could be disconfirmed, but you also gave an example with competition policy, although I'm not sure it's clearly decentralization. Is it really renationalization? Of course, I think that's also something which needs to operationalize better. So these are really extremely helpful comments, and also some of the weak spots that I feel myself the paper still have. And also Jonathan suggested in the chat where that I should pay much more attention. Probably it's that I focus the paper more on the second step of the analysis, how the governance structure links to the policy outcomes, and that's probably really also the more interesting thing. Just a final word on Amy's big picture question. So I think what we see in the banking union is, of course, that we have a case, we move forward because it's differentiated integration. But I think what I could tease out more also in the paper, that it's then underpinned by other processes such as segmented or discovered integration. And I sort of don't discuss a federalist or a big picture or big step approaches, right? There could be other paths as well. So I think this is clearly something that we see, but we could of course see that, and we see, and what we also see, and I think that is something that Lucia and David's paper on financial integration shows so nicely, and EMU, that we do not only see positive spillovers, but also kinds of negative spillovers from differentiated integration. So it really is also the question, where does this differentiated integration lead us? But what I see, and that's outside this paper, is still a regulatory power expansion of the EU currently also. I mean, it's a question whether it will be successful, right, in the area of digital and green, but I stop here. And I think this is food for more discussion. Thank you so much, because we reconvene early tomorrow.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for the good presentations, great discussion. And the final words are for Vincent.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, as everybody else, thank you so much for this still very lively debate. And there are still, I think, 15 attendees plus our panelists here. So everyone who's still here and listening to us, congratulations, you've shown some real commitment, and we are looking forward to seeing you again in every SAFE event from now on. So stay committed. And there were a few issues in the chat, a few comments, and I think maybe you haven't saved it. So I've saved the whole chat on my computer, and I can tell you it's the most cursed document, which I will make happily available to everyone. Jonathan and Barbara also said that they are looking forward to watching our debate tomorrow. Indeed, this is all recorded and will be made available. You will get more information, especially if you don't want to appear in the recording. So if you, for some reason, don't want to be a YouTube superstar, I don't know why you wouldn't, but your decision. Having said all that, I think we all deserve some sleep or some work when you're in Canada or the US. Good morning, everyone. And yeah. See you all tomorrow.